All right, guys, welcome to part 2 of our Standard 3 review. And remember that Standard 3 encompasses a lot, so I split it into 2 videos. And you should have already taken the quiz over part 1, and this is going to go with the quiz for part 2, okay? What we know is that this time period, the United States has just split away from the British. We have fought the Revolutionary War, and we have won. And right after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the United States is now officially its own country. And the focus now is going to shift to trying to create a government that can run this new country, but also there's a lot of fear by these Americans because they're worried that could the government that they create be just as bad or worse than the government that they just got rid of with the British? So we know that right after the Revolutionary War, the government that we are using is this government known as the Articles of Confederation, and you're going to want to highlight that. And what we know is that the Articles of Confederation was too weak, which is why we don't have it now today, right? We replaced it with the U.S. Constitution. So why was this government too weak? Well, in their fear of creating this tyrannical government, what the Founding Fathers did was they created a government that gave all of the real power of the government to the states rather than the central government. And we know that our Constitution today is the exact opposite. We have this thing called the Supremacy Clause that says that the federal government is above the state government. But this government is flipped. So in the Articles, it is the states are above the federal government, okay? And that's going to be a real problem, and we're going to get into the sort of direct strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation in the next slide. But what we want to know is that this government lasts from 1776, so they created it right as the Revolutionary War was starting after the Declaration of Independence, and lasts until 1789 when it gets replaced by the Constitution, right? Okay, so let's get into these strengths and weaknesses of this document. When I say strengths, what I'm talking about are what powers did the central government actually have, right? What did they agree to give up? First, the central government underneath the Articles of Confederation could declare war. The individual states could not do that. And they did that for a very specific reason. They did not want Georgia to be able to declare war on another country and then drag in, Pennsylvania and New York and South Carolina and Virginia and all these other states into a war that they didn't want to fight. So in order to declare war, the central government had to be in control of doing that. The central government could also coin money, and what I mean by that is they could actually create money, okay? Now, there was a problem with that, though, because during the Articles of Confederation, most of the states had their own money as well, so there was some confusion. Do you use the money from the central government, or do you use the money from your state? And in a lot of these places, they just relied on the money from their state, which made it hard to trade. Is a Georgia dollar worth the same as a Virginia dollar, and how do you work out whose money is worth more or whose money is worth less, The central government could also establish post offices. Remember that was a big deal in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. Benjamin Franklin, he is the one who sort of set up these things called the Committees of Correspondence, which was sort of like a communication network between the different colonies. And, they realized how important it was for all of the states to be able to communicate and for people to be able to communicate. So they did establish post offices with this government. And this government could send and recall ambassadors to other countries, and that's a big deal because an ambassador is basically just a representative from the United States that goes and works out trade agreements and peace agreements with other countries. Well, they need to represent the whole country, and so the central government was in charge of that because what if somebody from Georgia worked out a peace agreement with another country that the other states didn't like or something like that? Okay, but as you can see here, the list of weaknesses is longer than the list of strengths for Articles because remember, this government is too weak, and the weaknesses are very important for the Articles of Confederation. This is why it's not still around. One thing that you are going to want to highlight if you printed out the notes is you want to know that the biggest weakness of the Articles of Confederation is their inability to tax. The central government could not tax without the consent of the states. Well, that sounds like a great thing to us, less taxes, but that's actually a real problem because we expect our government to do a lot of things for us, and if they don't have the taxes, they can't afford to do it. And the primary one is we expect them to have a military, and if the government can't raise money, they can't have a military. And if you remember, the primary event that showed that the Articles of Confederation was too weak was actually Shays' Rebellion. And if you remember that story, Daniel Shay was an American Revolutionary War veteran who was really angry because he came back to his home state of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts government was taxing people. And Daniel Shay's farm was actually going to be taken away from him, and and he was actually going to be thrown in jail because he couldn't pay his taxes. And so then he goes on this revolt. He and a bunch of other Revolutionary War veterans who were losing their farms go and take over a bunch of courthouses in Massachusetts and in the Northeast, and there's nobody to stop them. And so it just kind of showed that without taxes, we can't enforce our laws and we can't protect people even from ourselves. And so that's going to be a big deal. The second one I have up here that's a weakness is they could not regulate interstate trade. So basically what had happened is some of the states were trying to pass tariffs on other states. So remember, tariffs are taxes on imports. And so Georgia would pass a tariff on goods coming in from South Carolina, and South Carolina would return those tariffs and do it as well. And it made it very hard for somebody to trade across state lines. And today that's not allowed. You cannot put tariffs on goods coming in and out of certain states, okay? There was also no executive or judicial branch in the Articles of Confederation. There was only a legislative branch. Remember, that's a big deal because the executive branch enforces laws, the judicial branch interprets laws, and so the only thing they could really do was make laws. But if you don't have anybody interpreting them and you don't have anybody enforcing them, then what good are the laws, right? And are people really following them the way that they're supposed to if they can't enforce them? And that, of course, goes back to the fact that they weren't collecting taxes and they didn't have anyone to make you enforce laws, right? Or make you follow laws, I should say. Again, we already talked about the fact that each state had its own money, and that just made it hard for trade. And the last one, another one that I would really sort of hone in on and want to know, is that the Articles were weak because in order to pass a law, you had to have 9 of the 13 states agree to it. But in order to amend the Articles to actually change it, you had to have all 13 states ratify an amendment. And that was almost impossible because remember, the concerns of these southern states is going to be very different than the concerns of the northern states and vice versa. So in order to get all of them to agree to pass an amendment, was seemingly impossible, which is why instead of trying to fix the Articles, they ended up just throwing it away. All right. The next thing we have up here is the Constitutional Convention, and this takes place in 1787. Remember that this is actually going to happen in Philadelphia. And what we know is that at the Articles of Confederation, at the Constitutional Convention, after Shays' Rebellion happens, the founding fathers get together and they say, okay, we got to do something about this government. And so they get together in Philadelphia, a couple of representatives from each state, and they decide that we are going to rewrite the Articles. But because they can't ratify it without everyone agreeing, they decide that they're just going to throw it away and start over. And they end up writing the United States Constitution, and that is still the law of the land in the United States today, okay? One thing I would want you to know is that the person who is considered the president of the Constitutional Convention and the one who was sort of running everything is George Washington. This is him right here, leading the convention. And it makes sense why they would pick George Washington. He had helped us win the Revolutionary War. He was a hero. People loved him. And so when it was time for them to sort of, get their arguments out and things like that, he was the one who could sort of work through the disagreements and help organize the conversation. And so other sort of notable people who were at the Constitutional Convention that you would want to know would be Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. Remember, he serves as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury later. And then Thomas Jefferson, again, third president of the United States. So he's going to be very instrumental at the Constitutional Convention with the Bill of Rights, right? Okay, so at the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of issues while they were writing this thing that actually could have led to the Constitution not getting passed. And of course, in government, whenever two sides are disagreeing, neither side is always going to get exactly what they want. Instead, they have to compromise, okay? And so as they are writing the Constitution, there were a couple of compromises that had to happen. The first compromise was all about slavery. So during the Constitutional Convention, some of the northern states had actually brought up the idea of ending slavery. Those discussions went away very quickly when they realized that the South was not going to have any of that. But as they were writing the Constitution, they started coming up with these ideas about representation, and there were these ideas about, should states with bigger populations have more power than states with smaller populations? And remember that in the House of Representatives, that is based on population. And so some southern states said, okay, we have this large population of people in our state, the slaves, but they can't vote, but we still want to be able to count them as part of our population so that we have more power in the House of Representatives. Well, the northern states say that's not fair. You don't let these people vote. Why should they have, any bearing in, the power of your state in the House of Representatives, how many representatives you get? Well, the South says, fine, if you're not going to let us count our slaves, then we won't ratify the Constitution. And so they had to come to a compromise. And what they did is they came up with this 3/5 compromise. And so basically what they decided is that the South could count 3/5 of their slaves as a part of their population in order to boost their population and get more votes in the House of Representatives. And fundamentally what the government was saying is that a slave is 3/5 of a person, which is a horrible thing to sort of have written into your Constitution. Of course, that goes away after the Civil War. And of course, this does not end the debate on slavery. We know that, that's going to take the Civil War to do that. Okay, and the second compromise that we have to know for the Constitution was the Great Compromise. And sometimes you will also see this written as the Connecticut Compromise. And remember, this is the compromise that actually creates our legislative branch and the way that the sort of representation or the power in the legislative branch is doled out. So how much power does each state get? Okay, and so remember at the Constitutional Convention, there were actually two plans for representation that were proposed to the people at the convention. The first plan was the Virginia plan. Okay, and remember that the Virginia plan is sometimes called the Big State Plan, and so basically, in the Virginia plan, what would have happened is if your state had more people in it, a larger population, then your state would have gotten more votes in Congress, okay? And that would give your state a lot more power to get the laws passed that you wanted. Well, if you were a large state like Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania, you would have said, that's awesome, because now my state is going to get exactly what they want when it comes to new laws. But if you're in a smaller state like New Jersey or Maryland, then you're going to be very unhappy because you're going to feel like your state is never going to get the laws passed that they want, or there might even be laws passed that are not beneficial to your state or hurt your state, okay? And so the small states all get together and they propose what is called the New Jersey Plan or the Small State Plan. And the Small State Plan says that each state gets the same amount of representation or the same amount of votes in Congress. And that's going to make the small states happy because they have just as much power as the big states, but it's going to make the big states very unhappy. And the reason why it makes the big states very unhappy is because they feel like, why should Virginia, who has this large population, why should all of the people there have the same amount of power as a state that doesn't have as much, has less of a population? And so, they feel like that's not fair. And both sides are unwilling to sort of compromise at first, but then they decide to come together and just combine these two plans. And what they create is our modern bicameral legislature, okay? So in the House of Representatives, that's like the Virginia plan. Each state gets more votes depending on what their population is. And remember that in the United States, every 10 years we have this thing called the census. So let's say you're in Georgia and the population of Georgia really is growing, but the population of, let's say, California is shrinking. Well, when they do the census, they'll add up the numbers of people in each state, and then they'll sort of redistribute how many votes each state gets in the House of Representatives. So maybe, you know, Georgia would get more votes and California would get less if their populations had changed that way. And the Senate is like the New Jersey plan, and in the Senate, each state gets 2 votes. Okay, and remember that there was actually one other compromise that we had went over, and that was actually the Bill of Rights. Because remember, when they were creating the Constitution, there was a real fear of creating a government that was too strong, and with this came our nation's first 2 political parties, which were called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And so basically, Thomas Jefferson leads this group of people called the Anti-Federalists and says that he will not ratify the Constitution unless you can guarantee us that that government will not become too strong. And what they come up with is the Bill of Rights, and that gets added to the Constitution later. It's the first 10 amendments, and remember that the amendments come at the end of the Constitution, and that's where you get things like the First Amendment that guarantees your right to, you know, freedom of speech and religion and the press, and Second Amendment, you know, right to own guns and things like that. So that is the laws that actually sort of guarantee your personal freedoms, and that was another compromise.